At 54, Rebecca's life had taken unexpected turns, marked by both sorrow and fleeting moments of joy. Widowed for years, she found solace in the routine of raising her two children, Emma and Jason. But as the years passed, a sense of longing began to grow within her, a yearning she could never speak aloud, for it was as dangerous as it was forbidden. Jason, at 23, had always been a caring and responsible son. After the death of his father, he had stepped into his role with dedication, often putting his own life on hold to care for his mother and older sister. Emma, the eldest, had been more independent, leaving home at 22 to build a life for herself. It was during those lonely months that Rebecca realized just how deep her feelings for Jason had become. He was no longer the boy she had raised. He was a man whose presence stirred feelings in her she had never imagined. One evening, as the house grew quieter with Emma's absence, Jason stayed behind to help his mother with the garden. They worked side by side, the warm evening sun casting a soft glow over them. Rebecca stole glances at him as he bent over to trim the flowers, noticing the way his muscles rippled under his shirt. She couldn't ignore the pull in her chest, the warmth that spread through her at the sound of his voice. He had grown into a man who was so much more than the boy she had once known. As night fell, they sat on the porch, the cool breeze caressing their faces. The conversation shifted from the usual small talk to something more intimate. Jason spoke about his future plans, his dreams, and Rebecca couldn't help but admire the way his eyes sparkled with ambition. But then, their eyes met, and for a brief moment, the world seemed to stand still. The air between them thickened, and Rebecca's heart raced, her thoughts spiraling into dangerous territory. She wanted to tell him how she felt, but fear gripped her heart, preventing her from speaking. Sense to change, an unspoken tension in the air. He had always been close to his mother, but something about her gaze felt different now. There was a subtle longing in her eyes that made him uneasy, but he couldn't shake the feeling that it was something more, a connection he hadn't noticed before. Days passed, and their interactions grew more complicated. Jason began to notice the way his mother's touch lingered a little longer, how she would find reasons to be near him. At first, he brushed it off, attributing it to the loneliness that came with the absence of his father. But soon, he couldn't ignore the shift in their relationship. The moments that once felt natural now seemed charged with a dangerous intimacy. One fateful night, as they were alone in the house, the air thick with unspoken desire, Rebecca found herself standing before Jason. Her heart pounded in her chest as she fought the urge to pull him into her arms, to confess the impossible feelings that had consumed her for so long. Jason, his own emotions a mix of confusion and desire, stepped closer. The distance between them closed, and for a fleeting moment, it seemed as if time had stopped, but before they could act on the overwhelming emotions that surged between them, Rebecca recoiled, realizing the gravity of what they were about to do. She couldn't. She shouldn't. With a shaky breath, she stepped back, breaking the fragile moment. Jason, equally breathless, looked at her with confusion and hurt in his eyes. "I'm sorry, Jason," Rebecca whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. This isn't right." "I can't." Jason stood there, stunned, unsure of what had just transpired. He knew something had changed, but the weight of their connection was too much to comprehend. Without another word, he turned away, leaving Rebecca to face the consequences of the emotion she had kept hidden for so long. Between them was a silent, forbidden thing, a desire neither of them could fully understand or act upon. As they both retreated into the confines of their own hearts, the house fell back into its familiar silence. But the echoes of their unspoken feelings lingered, leaving them both wondering if their love could ever be anything more than a dangerous fantasy. The silence that followed that night was unbearable. Rebecca spent her days trying to regain control of her emotions, but every glance at Jason seemed to pierce through the fragile wall she had built around herself. She couldn't forget the intensity of that moment, the way their breath had mingled, how their proximity had felt like an unspoken confession. The longing in her heart had been awakened, but it was a feeling she dared not acknowledge. Jason, too, was struggling. His thoughts were consumed with the night that had almost changed everything. He had never seen his mother like that, vulnerable, full of unspoken emotion. He had always seen her as strong, the pillar of their family, the one who kept everything together. But now, there was a crack in her armor, and it terrified him. Why did he feel this pull toward her? Why couldn't he shake the feeling that there was something deeper, something darker, between them? The next few weeks were filled with unspoken words and careful glances. Emma returned to the house, and with her presence, The strange tension between Jason and Rebecca seemed to dissipate, at least on the surface. But Rebecca felt herself drifting further away, isolated by the secret desire that simmered within her, a desire she could not reveal. Jason, though, couldn't help but sense something had changed. He began noticing the small things, the way his mother would catch his eye, the way her smile seemed to linger a little longer than before. It was subtle, but it was enough to ignite a flame of curiosity that he couldn't. As Rebecca prepared dinner, she was startled by a soft knock at the door. It was Jason, standing there with a hesitant look in his eyes. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice low, almost tentative. Rebecca nodded, gesturing for him to come in. They sat down at the kitchen table, the room heavy with the weight of unspoken words. Jason's hands trembled slightly as he looked at her, struggling to find the right words. I don't know what's happening," Jason began, his voice raw with emotion. "I can't stop thinking about what happened. What we almost did. And I don't know if it's wrong. I don't know if it's just my mind playing tricks on me, or if it's something more. But I can't stop feeling it. Mom!" Something's changed. Rebecca's heart raced, her breath shallow as she met his gaze. This was the moment she had feared. She had tried to bury her feelings, to push them away, but hearing Jason admit what they both had felt made it impossible to ignore. She had to be strong for him, for both of them. But the words she had prepared seemed to choke in her throat. "Jason," she whispered, her voice trembling. We can't go down this path. There's too much at stake. Too much to lose, but why does it feel so right?" he countered, his eyes filled with confusion and longing. "Why does it feel like there's something between us that we've been ignoring all this time?" Rebecca's chest tightened, and she felt the weight of his words settle deep in her bones. The emotional depth of their bond was undeniable, but it was dangerous, a road they could never travel. Yet, in the silence that followed, Rebecca realized something unsettling. She wasn't ready to let go of him. The pull was too strong. The vulnerability they shared in that moment left them both open, exposed, like a wound that couldn't heal. "Jason," Rebecca said softly, her voice barely audible, "we can't let this." His hand reached across the table, his fingers brushing against hers, sending a jolt of warmth through her. Neither of them pulled away. The room felt charged with unspoken emotion as their eyes locked once more. They were caught in a web of desire, confusion, and fear. It wasn't love. It was something more complicated, more dangerous. A forbidden longing that neither could fully understand. For a long moment, they sat in silence, the air between them thick with tension. Neither knew how to break the silence, but both knew that their lives could never be the same. Whatever had begun to stir between them could never be erased. Rebecca knew she had to be strong, for Jason's sake. But as he stood to leave, the brief touch of his hand lingering in hers, she felt a part of her slip away. She had to protect him, protect them both from a desire that could never be fulfilled, but the truth was undeniable. No matter how hard she tried to fight it, the bond between them had shifted. There was no going back. Days turned into weeks, and the house felt like a pressure cooker filled with unspoken emotions that simmered just below the surface. Rebecca tried to carry on as usual, focusing on the mundane tasks of daily life, but every glance at Jason reminded her of the tension that had taken root between them. It was subtle, but it was there lurking in the shadows of their interactions. Impossible to ignore. Jason, too, felt it. The weight of his mother's gaze, the fleeting touches that now seemed laden with unspoken meaning, the way she would sometimes freeze mid-sentence when their eyes met. It was as if a new, unsettling dynamic had taken hold of their relationship, one neither of them could fully understand, but both of them were unwilling to confront. It was on one such evening, as they sat down to dinner, that the tension finally broke. Jason had been unusually quiet throughout the meal. Rebecca noticed it, the way his fingers would linger on it, how his eyes would dart nervously around the room. It was clear he was grappling with something more than just the usual stress of life. He hadn't spoken much since that night, when the moment between them had nearly crossed a line. That night, they had both felt something they couldn't explain. Now, it seemed to have become a rift, a space between them neither was sure how to navigate. "Jason," Rebecca finally spoke, her voice gentle but firm, "you've been quiet. What's going on?" He paused, his fork halfway to his mouth, then put it down with a sigh. The room seemed to close in around them, the sound of his breath the only thing that filled the space. His eyes met hers. Intense and searching, and for a brief moment, it felt as though time had stopped. I don't know how to say this, he began, his voice strained. But I can't stop thinking about what happened. About that moment between us. It's like something's changed, and I can't ignore it anymore. I feel like I'm walking on the edge of something. Rebecca's heart skipped a beat. She had hoped this conversation wouldn't come, that somehow, with enough time, the tension would fade. But hearing Jason say it aloud made it all too real. The fear, the desire, the unspoken pull, it was all coming to a head. Jason, she said softly, her voice trembling, we can't. Whatever it is you're feeling. It's not something we can act on. We can't let it ruin us. We can't let it ruin our family. Jason's eyes searched hers, his expression unreadable. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came. There was a long, tense silence, the air thick with the weight of his unspoken thoughts. Rebecca's pulse raced, the need to escape, to break the unbearable tension, flooding her with anxiety. She stood abruptly, the chair scraping harshly against the floor. I need some air, she said quickly, more to herself than to him. Before Jason could respond, she fled out the door and inside. The cool air hit her face like a slap. The world felt muted, distant, as though she was standing on the edge of a precipice, looking down into an abyss she wasn't sure she was willing to fall into. She could still feel Jason's eyes on her, even though she had left the room. That intense, desperate look, he was struggling with something that mirrored her own fears, her own desires. The attraction, the connection, it was undeniable. But it was also dangerous. Rebecca paced the yard, her thoughts racing. She had spent so long protecting Jason, keeping him safe from the harshness of the world, and now, she felt like she was losing him, not in the way she feared when his father passed away, but in a far more terrifying way. This wasn't about the past, it was about the present, and the future they would have to face. How could she protect him from something so volatile, something that threatened to destroy everything? The creak of the door behind her made her freeze. She turned to see Jason standing there, his face drawn, his eyes filled with a mixture of guilt and longing. He had followed her outside, unable to let her bear the weight of their shared turmoil alone. I don't know what's happening between us, Mom, Jason confessed, his voice low, breaking the silence. But it feels like I'm losing control. I'm scared of what this is. Scared of what we're becoming. Rebecca's heart ached as she saw the vulnerability in his eyes. She stepped closer, her voice barely a whisper. You're not losing control, Jason. But this can't go any further. We have to stop. We have to find a way to move past this before it destroys everything. Jason nodded, his eyes dropping to the ground as if in defeat. But then, there was a flicker, a glimmer of something else. He reached out, his hand brushing against hers, sending a surge of electricity through her. For a second, it felt like the entire world was holding it. I can't stop thinking about you, Jason whispered, his voice raw, vulnerable. I can't stop feeling like you're the only one who understands me. I don't want to lose that. Rebecca closed her eyes, fighting the urge to pull him into her arms. This was wrong, so wrong, but how could she deny the connection? How could she deny the pull that was stronger than anything she had ever felt before? But she had to. For both of them, she had to. Jason, she said, her voice breaking, we can't go down this road. It's not just about us anymore. It's about the future. It's about keeping the family together, and we can't destroy that. There was a long silence between them, heavy with the weight of their shared desire and mutual fear. Slowly, Jason let go of her hand and took a step back. But his eyes lingered on her, filled with emotions too complex to put into words. I just don't know how to stop feeling this way, he murmured, his voice distant now, almost broken. I know, Rebecca whispered, her own heart shattering as she turned away. But we have to. The days after that conversation felt like a heavy fog had settled over the house. Despite their best efforts, the tension between Rebecca and Jason lingered, unspoken but always present. It was as though an invisible thread connected them, one that they could neither pull apart nor sever. But there was also Emma, and her return to the house had only intensified the complexity of the situation. Rebecca had hoped that Emma's presence would offer a sense of normalcy, a way to put the strange distance between her and Jason to rest. Yet, as the days went on, she couldn't ignore the subtle shifts in the way Emma looked at her. It was as if Emma sensed something was amiss, though neither of them spoke about it directly. Emma had always been perceptive, and Rebecca was afraid that her daughter had begun to notice the underlying tension in the air. But Emma's silence on the matter only heightened the mystery. The conversation felt carefully measured, as if Emma, too, was treading carefully, afraid to disturb the fragile equilibrium that had once defined their family. One evening, after a quiet dinner, Rebecca found herself sitting in the living room, alone. The house was eerily still, save for the occasional creak of the floorboards. Jason was in his room, and Emma had retreated to the study, though Rebecca couldn't shake the feeling that Emma was, in fact, keeping her distance. It was subtle, Emma's quiet glances, the way she avoided certain topics, but Rebecca couldn't help but wonder if Emma, too, was feeling the strange, inexplicable pull that had enveloped their home, just as Rebecca was about to pour herself a glass of wine. The doorbell rang, breaking the silence. She glanced at the clock. It was late, far later than anyone would normally visit. Hesitant but curious, she made her way to the door and opened it to find Emma standing there, her expression unreadable. "Can we talk?" Emma asked quietly, her voice soft, yet there was an edge of something Rebecca couldn't quite place. Rebecca stepped aside to let Emma in, her heart pounding in her chest. She had been trying to avoid these moments, the ones where everything between them might come to the surface. But it seemed like the time had finally come. The two women sat down on the couch, the silence between them thick with unspoken words. Emma's eyes were focused on her hands, fiddling with the hem of her sleeve. Rebecca, too, struggled to find the words, knowing this conversation could change everything. "Mom," Emma finally began, her voice trembling just slightly, "I need to ask you something. And I need you to be honest with me." Rebecca felt her stomach drop. She had no idea where this conversation was headed, but she could feel the weight of it pressing on her chest. "Anything," Rebecca said, though her voice cracked with anything going on between you and Jason? Emma's question was blunt, piercing, and Rebecca felt a chill run down her spine. The words hung in the air, and for a long moment, Rebecca couldn't speak. She had always promised Emma that she would be open, but this was different. The silence was deafening. "Emma," Rebecca finally whispered, I don't know what you mean. There's nothing going on between Jason and me." Emma's gaze was unwavering, and Rebecca could see the doubt flickering in her eyes. She wasn't convinced. "I know something's been off," Emma said, her voice barely audible now. "You and Jason, you both seem so distant, like there's something you're both hiding from me. I don't know what it is, but it feels like it's tearing us apart. I need to know, Mom. What's really going on?" Rebecca's mind raced, her heart thudding in her chest. She had never expected Emma to confront her like this, and the fear of losing her daughter made her feel even more vulnerable. How could she explain the unspoken, overwhelming feelings that had been building between her and Jason? How could she possibly make sense of it to Emma? "I don't know what you think is happening, but I swear to you, Emma, it's nothing like that," Rebecca said, trying to reassure her. But deep inside, Rebecca knew the truth wasn't as simple as she wished it could be. Emma remained silent for a moment, her face a mixture of confusion and hurt. "It's not just about what you feel for Jason, is it? It's about all of us, isn't it? About how everything feels different now. Like we're all walking around pretending everything's normal, when it's not. You and him, you've both changed. And I don't know how to fix it." Rebecca, "I never wanted any of this," Rebecca whispered. "I never wanted to hurt you, or Jason. But there are things that I can't control. I don't know how to explain it, Emma. I just don't." Emma looked at her, her eyes softening as she reached out to take her hand. "I don't need you to explain everything," she said gently. "I just need you to tell me the truth. Whatever it is. I need to know you're not lost in this. That you're still my mom. That you're still here." The words were like a weight lifted from Rebecca's chest. She realized that Emma wasn't angry, she was scared. Scared of losing the family they had once been, scared of the unknown forces that seemed to be pulling them in different directions. Rebecca squeezed Emma's hand, her voice breaking as she spoke. "I promise you, Emma, I'm still here. I'll never leave you. But sometimes I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know how to fix everything." Emma nodded, and for a moment, the two of them sat there, sharing a quiet understanding, their hands still entwined. It wasn't a solution, but it was a start. Just then, the door creaked, and both women turned to see Jason standing in the doorway. His face was a mix of guilt and apprehension, and for a fleeting moment, it felt like they were all caught in an unspoken web of fear and desire. "I didn't mean to interrupt," Jason said quietly, his eyes flicking between the two women. "But I think it's time we talk. All of us." The evening after the confrontation hung thick with uncertainty. Rebecca couldn't remember the last time the house had felt so quiet, the air so heavy with unspoken truths. Emma's words had pierced her heart like a shard of ice. She had always tried to be the strong, protective mother, the one who kept everything together. But now, the delicate threads of their family's dynamic were unraveling, and she couldn't figure out who, too, had been distant since their last conversation. He had kept to his room more, only emerging for meals, his presence like a shadow rather than a person. The house, once full of familiar warmth and routine, now felt foreign, charged with a tension that neither of them seemed able to shake. But Rebecca couldn't help but feel the weight of her daughter's gaze when Emma spoke, the unspoken accusation in her eyes. Was Emma beginning to see the subtle shifts in the way they interacted? Was she sensing the quiet rift between them? As Rebecca sat alone in the living room, the sound of a door creaking broke the silence. She turned, startled, and saw Jason standing at the threshold. His figure framed by the dim light from the hallway. His gaze met hers, but it wasn't the usual easy warmth she'd once relied on. There was something else there, something deeper, heavier. "Can we talk?" Jason's voice was soft, almost tentative. Rebecca's heart skipped a beat, a lump forming in her throat. She had been dreading this moment, knowing it was inevitable. But she nodded, unable to deny him. "Of course. Come in." Jason stepped into the room, closing the door behind him. There was a quiet intensity about him, a silence that seemed to speak louder than words. He sat down on the couch across from her, keeping a careful distance. It was as though he was trying to respect some invisible boundary. Though they both knew that the lines between them had already blurred beyond recognition, for a long moment, neither of them spoke. Rebecca's mind raced, wondering where this conversation would lead. She wanted to ask about Emma, about her reaction to the tension between them, but she feared the answer. What if Emma had seen something more than they had realized? Jason shifted in his seat, his eyes dropping to his hands before he finally spoke again. "I've been thinking about everything. About what Emma said. And about how things have changed." Rebecca's pulse quickened. She had known Jason was struggling, but hearing him admit it aloud made it all the more real. "It's not just about us," he continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's about the whole family. I feel like we're all drifting away from each other. And I don't know what to do about it." Rebecca felt a pang of guilt. She had tried to keep things normal, to protect them both from the growing distance, but it seemed like they were all slowly pulling apart. She couldn't fix everything on her own, and the realization that they needed to face this together, as a family, was both terrifying and relieving. "I feel it too," Rebecca admitted, her voice trembling slightly. "But I don't know how to fix it either, Jason. We're all so tangled up in our own emotions right now. I just don't know where to begin." Jason's gaze lingered on her, and for a moment, it felt like they were both trapped in the same web of confusion and longing. The silence between them grew heavy, charged with something unsaid, something that neither of them dared to acknowledge out loud. Just then, a soft knock at the door interrupted their quiet moment. Emma's voice drifted through the crack in the door. "Mom? Jason? Can I come in?" Rebecca and Jason exchanged a brief, unreadable look before Rebecca nodded. "Yes, Emma. Come in." Emma entered the room slowly, her expression guarded, as though she too was unsure of what to say next. She took a seat on the edge of the couch, her eyes flicking between Rebecca and Jason, as if searching for something she couldn't quite put into words. "Have you two been talking?" Emma asked, her tone a mix of curiosity and caution. Jason nodded, his jaw tightening slightly. "We've been trying to figure things out." Rebecca met Emma's gaze, but there was no anger in her eyes, only a deep sadness, as if she, too, understood the weight of the situation. Emma said after a moment, her voice quiet but firm. "I didn't mean to make everything worse. I don't know what's happening. I feel like I'm losing you both." Rebecca felt a knot form in her stomach. Emma had always been the strong one, the one who could face the world with a smile no matter what. But this was different. Emma was no longer a child, she was a young woman, aware of the fragility of the family they had built. And that awareness was both a burden and a blessing. "You're not losing us, Emma," Rebecca said softly, her heart aching for her daughter. We're just trying to figure things out. There's a lot of confusion right now. But we're a family. We'll always be a family." Emma nodded, though Rebecca could see the uncertainty in her eyes. She wasn't convinced, not completely. And Rebecca wasn't sure she could convince her. Not yet. Not until they all confronted the truth, whatever that might be. Jason stood up, his movements slow, deliberate. "I think we need to talk more. All of us. About everything." Rebecca glanced at him, unsure of what that would mean for their fragile relationship, but she knew it had to happen. The silence between them was no longer an option, as the three of them sat there, each caught in their own internal battles, the weight of their shared history pressed down on them. The bonds that tied them together had been tested, stretched to the breaking point. But as they looked at one another, something in their eyes told them they weren't ready to let go. Not yet. The once serene home had transformed into a place of looming dread. After the night of raw confessions, the tension between Rebecca, Jason, and Emma had reached a boiling point. It was as if a crack had appeared in the foundation of their family, something deep and irrevocable that none of them could ignore. But what none of them expected was the deadly force that would tear them apart. It started with strange occurrences. A distant creak in the middle of the night. Whispered voices carried by the wind, though the windows were shut tight. Small objects moved from their usual spots, coins, photographs, trinkets, disappearing for hours, only to reappear again in unsettling places. It was enough to unsettle anyone, but it was clear to Rebecca that something far more sinister was at work. This wasn't just some playful ghost or a trick of the mind. This was something darker. One evening, after a long day of tension-filled silence, Emma had insisted on going for a walk in the woods behind their house. Rebecca had cautioned her against it, but Emma's restlessness had gotten the better of her. Jason, though quieter than usual, seemed eager to go along. "Are you sure you want to go out there?" Rebecca had asked, her voice strained with a mixture of worry and dread. "It's getting late." Emma shot her a look. "I'll be fine. It's just the woods, Mom. Relax." But Rebecca couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Her intuition, sharp, honed over years of protecting her family, told her they should stay inside. Yet, with Jason and Emma both so adamant about going, she reluctantly relented. The woods were thick with fog when they set off, the air heavy with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. The trio walked in silence, each of them lost in their thoughts, unable to escape the underlying tension. There was an odd stillness to the forest, as though it were holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Jason was the first to notice it, the shadows moving unnaturally in the corner of his vision. It was subtle at first, like a flicker of movement just beyond the trees, but as they ventured deeper into the woods, the feeling intensified. He slowed his pace, glancing over his shoulder, but there was nothing there. Emma, ahead of him, seemed unaware of the unease settling over her brother. "Come on, Jason. Catch up," she called, her voice echoing in the quiet of, but as she turned to look back, her expression faltered. She, too, had felt it, something wrong in the air. Jason quickened his step, his heart racing. "I don't like this," he muttered, his voice tight with tension, but Emma just laughed it off, her mind still set on escaping the turmoil of home. She pushed through the fog, the mist wrapping around her like a shroud. Jason and Rebecca followed, but the deeper they ventured, the colder it became. And the further they moved from the safety of the house, the more Jason's sense of dread grew. Suddenly, a blood-curdling scream split the air. It was Emma. The sound echoed through the trees, shattering the silence and sending a chill down their spines. Jason froze, his heart hammering in his chest. "Emma!" he shouted, his voice trembling. He and Rebecca ran toward the source of the scream, the fog thickening around them, obscuring their vision. The trees loomed like dark giants, their branches twisting overhead, blocking out what little light remained. When they finally reached Emma, what they saw froze them both in their tracks. Emma was standing in the middle of a clearing, her eyes wide with terror, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Blood was dripping from her hands, staining her clothes. But there was no wound, no source for the blood. It was as if it had materialized from thin air. Her eyes were locked on something in the distance, something she couldn't or wouldn't look away from. "Emma, what happened?" Rebecca cried, her voice shaking. Emma's lips parted, but no words came. Her gaze flicked from Rebecca to Jason, her expression a mix of confusion and fear. Then, as if snapped from a trance, she finally spoke in a hoarse whisper. "It's him. He's here. He's watching us." Jason turned in every direction, but all he could see was the dense fog creeping in from all sides. Nothing moved. The woods were silent again, as if, "Who, Emma?" Jason demanded, stepping forward, but his own fear was palpable. "Who's watching us?" "I don't know," Emma gasped, her voice trembling. I saw someone. In the woods. He was following us. And then the blood, it just appeared." Rebecca felt a cold wave of dread wash over her. This was no ordinary prank. The blood wasn't real, it couldn't be. But the terror in Emma's eyes, it was real enough. They made their way back to the house, but as they neared the clearing near the edge of the woods, Jason froze. Something glimmered in the trees, a flash of metal. He couldn't make it out, but his instincts screamed at him to run. Suddenly, a sharp crack echoed through the woods. Like a gunshot, and a figure emerged from the mist. The silhouette was tall, cloaked in darkness, but Jason recognized the outline of a person, someone tall and ominous. His pulse quickened, and he grabbed Emma's arm. "Run!" He shouted, but the words were barely out of his mouth when a voice broke through the fog. "Don't run from me, Jason. You're not safe anywhere," the voice purred, deep and ominous. Rebecca's eyes widened in recognition. The voice was familiar, too familiar. It was a voice she hadn't heard in years, a voice that had been buried in her past. And that's when it hit her, this wasn't just about strange occurrences. This was personal. Suddenly, the figure stepped forward, revealing his face, though it was obscured by shadows. And the world seemed to tilt. "Who are you?" Rebecca whispered, her heart racing, as memories of long-buried secrets surged to the surface. The figure chuckled darkly, his presence sending a wave of unease through her body. "I'm the reason your family is broken, Rebecca. The reason all of this is happening." The atmosphere in the woods grew even more suffocating, as if the very air had turned toxic, and every breath felt like a struggle. Rebecca, Jason, and Emma stood at the figure in the distance, still shrouded in the mist, watching them with terrifying stillness. The crack of the trees underfoot seemed louder than it had ever been before. The figure moved forward once again, its form cloaked in shadows, but with each step, its presence grew more undeniable. Jason's breath hitched in his throat as he held on to Emma, his mind racing with thoughts of escape. But there was no escape. This wasn't a random attack. This was personal. And whoever stood in the fog knew their deepest secrets. "Who the hell are you?" Jason demanded, trying to sound braver than he felt. His pulse quickened, but his voice shook with fear. "What do you want from us?" The figure stopped just beyond the mist. Still far enough away to remain a blurry outline, but close enough for the tension to become unbearable. The voice that came through the fog was chilling, dripping with menace. "You don't recognize me, Jason? It's been so long." The voice was low, but familiar, too familiar. Rebecca's heart dropped in her chest, the color draining from her face. "No," she whispered. "It can't be. No." Jason's eyes darted between Rebecca and the figure. "Who is that, Mom?" he asked urgently. Rebecca swallowed hard, struggling to find her voice. "It's him. It's him." The figure's face came into view then, just enough for them to see a twisted, unnerving smile spread across his face. It was a face that hadn't been seen in years, a face that haunted Rebecca's nightmares. A man she had hoped to leave behind forever. Her ex-husband. Jason and Emma's father, who had mysteriously disappeared years ago, leaving their family fractured and scarred. "But how is he standing here now? I see you've moved on, Rebecca," he said, his voice dark and taunting. "Built a new life, found a new family. But I'm still here. Watching. Waiting." Rebecca stepped back, her knees weakening under the weight of her emotions. It was impossible. He had been gone for so long. She had tried to forget him, to erase the pain he had caused. But now, it seemed he had come back to finish what he started. Jason's hand tightened on Emma's arm. No way. This doesn't make sense. You're dead. You've been gone. How can you? The figure took a step closer, almost gliding through the fog. Dead? Oh, Jason, I'm very much alive. And I've been watching. Waiting for the right moment to return. The family, the one you tried to build without me? It's about to come crashing down. This time, no one will leave unscathed. Rebecca's mind reeled. She had thought he was dead, had buried the memories of him and their broken marriage, hoping to heal her family. But now, seeing him standing before her, she was paralyzed with fear. Jason's words echoed in her mind. How can he be alive? How indeed? I did everything for you, Rebecca, he continued, his eyes cold and calculating. And this is how you repay me? You think you can just move on like I never mattered? Tears stung Rebecca's eyes as she struggled to contain her fear. She knew, deep down, that nothing good would come of this confrontation. He wasn't here for a reunion. He was here for something far darker. Jason stepped forward, his fists clenched. You don't scare me. You won't get away with this. Not again. The figure tilted his head, considering Jason's defiance, before he laughed, a harsh, hollow laugh that sent chills down their spines. Oh, Jason, you don't understand. I'm not here for a reunion. I'm here for revenge. Suddenly, the ground under their feet seemed to tremble. The fog thickened, swirling around them like an impenetrable wall, and a sudden, sharp cry echoed through the trees. A sound so horrific, so guttural, that it made their blood run cold. Rebecca's heart slammed in her chest. What was that? She gasped, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The figure's expression twisted into something sinister. The game has begun, he said. Thought you were safe, but now you'll pay for your betrayal. Before anyone could react, the sound of branches snapping violently pierced the air. Something was moving toward them, something big, something fast. And it was heading straight for them. Jason turned to run, but Emma grabbed his arm, panic written across her face. What is that? What's coming? Rebecca's mind was racing. She knew what was coming. The man in front of them wasn't just an angry ex-husband. He had planned this, whatever it was, for years. And the scream that echoed through the woods. It wasn't just a random noise. It was a warning. Get back to the house, Rebecca shouted, her voice filled with urgency. Now! But the figure moved again, stepping into their path. You think you can escape me again? After everything you've done? His eyes flashed with fury as he raised a knife, a long, gleaming blade that caught the moonlight in a deadly gleam. Rebecca froze. She had seen that knife before. It had been in their house, in their lives, an instrument of terror, of control. It had been his weapon. He had used it to break her, to break them. Now it was back, and it was here to finish what he started. Run! Jason screamed again, pushing Emma forward. But there was no time. The fog swirled violently, cutting off their escape routes. Rebecca glanced toward the house. It was too far. The woods were closing in around them, the trees seemingly closing ranks to trap them in. She had to act fast. She wasn't going to lose her family again. With a primal scream, she lunged forward, her hands grabbing a thick branch from the ground and using it to block the knife. The force of the strike sent a jolt through her arms, but it slowed him down just enough. Get to the house! Rebecca shouted, her voice raw with fear and anger. She was ready to protect her children, to keep them safe no matter the cost. Ran, fear propelling them forward as Rebecca turned to face the dark figure standing between her and her family. But as they neared the house, another scream echoed in the night, a sound that chilled them to the bone. The game was far from over, and none of them knew how far it would go before they were trapped, forever.